Tonight on Primetime Politics, Ottawa's mayor takes the stand.
It was lawlessness. They were harassing people in restaurants, tearing off their masks.
Testifying before the Public Order Emergency Commission, Jim Watson describes the chaos on the ground and the frustration behind closed doors as Ottawa tried to get Ontario's Ford government more engaged.
I think there was a sense by some in the community, why is the Premier not here? But
we'll take a look at what we learned on this day 4 of the inquiry's work. And
this is not within the spirit and intent of reconciliation, and it's very paternalistic.
Assembly of First Nations Chief RoseAnne Archibald on establishing a National Council for Reconciliation. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. It's been a long day for Ottawa's Mayor Jim Watson. Spending hours before the Public Order Emergency Commission, the mayor talked about the challenge protesters created for city officials, the actions he found most troubling, and how thankful he was for what the Emergencies Act made possible.
I thought this is a very positive step to getting this situation resolved once and for all because of the provisions in the Act. So I very much supported it, and I was, as you may recall, the current chair of the Police Service Board, Eli El-Shantir, and I sent a letter to the Prime Minister thanking him for invoking the Act because it actually acted as the catalyst for us to move forward and get that whole situation in the downtown core resolved once and for all and give people their street and their homes back.
Well, with more, let's bring in CPAC's Andrew Thomson, who's been covering the story. So, Andrew, what more did we hear from the Ottawa mayor? Because in practical terms, what arguments did he make in favor of using the Act?
Well, Michael, Jim Watson admitted today that both the city and police had lost control of the situation in downtown Ottawa, and they needed help to end the lawlessness that had taken root, and they needed help to get vehicles removed from the occupation zone. So while the mayor said that the city had not formally requested or been consulted about that federal emergency declaration, he does believe Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did the right thing in invoking the Emergencies Act, especially because one provision of that act made tow trucks an essential service, and that compelled hesitant operators to begin clearing the streets. Here's part of what Jim Watson said today as he recalled that process beginning to happen.
I can tell you it sounds a little bit hokey, but when I came out of City Hall after the Emergency Act, I saw a whole row of tow trucks parked on Laurier Avenue. I'd never thought I'd see the day where I'm so happy to see a tow truck, because these tow trucks ended up doing an excellent job, basically hauling all of the trucks and trailers and campers and everything else out of Wellington Street. And what they had to do, because the companies were still fearful there'd be retribution by some of the trucking convoy, they had to put decals of the Ottawa Police Service over their company decal, almost deputizing them with a logo so that they wouldn't be harassed after the whole incident was over.
And Michael, the mayor mentioned Wellington Street just now. Jim Watson also saying today if he could go back in time, he would have insisted on barricades on that street to prevent the convoy from establishing itself in that symbolic location right in front of Parliament Hill. Now, that stretch of Wellington Street remains closed to traffic, and the mayor said it remains an open question over which jurisdiction will ultimately police that part of the parliamentary precinct.
Now, also coming out today was the issue of action or inaction on behalf of the Ontario government, because while thankful for their ultimate engagement, Mayor Watson did express some frustration about the seeming lack of urgency from the Ford government. Talk to us about that.
Right, Michael, several glimpses of that criticism in Jim Watson's testimony today and in some of the email evidence we saw. We learned the mayor told the Prime Minister on February 8th that Ontario's then Solicitor General Sylvia Jones was being, quote, disingenuous about the level of provincial police support being provided. The Prime Minister and the mayor also talked about Ontario Premier Doug Ford staying distant for, quote, political reasons. That included a refusal to join a working group coordinating the government response to the occupation. Here's Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson talking about one of his conversations with the Premier.
The Premier was adamant that he did not feel it would be useful to have 3 levels of politicians sitting around a table.
And did he say why he didn't think that was going to be, that wasn't necessary or helpful?
Well, I think he felt it would be a waste of time. When he said that, I was quite frustrated with him. He said, look at what's it going to accomplish? A bunch of people sitting around a table talking and making decisions. And I said, well, that sounds like a cabinet meeting. And he didn't like that. But at the end of the day, it was his call. If he wasn't going to go to force his minister to go to the meeting or not go to the meeting, he just said they're not going to be part of it.
And Watson also alleged Doug Ford didn't want to, quote, wear the situation in downtown Ottawa because he considered the whole occupation to be a local police responsibility. Watson did testify, however, that the provincial government was a strong partner once Queen's Park became more engaged, but he does believe the entire occupation could have been ended much sooner. Michael.
CPAC's Andrew Thomson, thank you. Well, members of Parliament are following the proceedings at the inquiry quite closely, and to talk about what we heard from the mayor in his testimony, we're now joined by Yasir Naqvi. He's the Liberal MP for the riding of Ottawa Centre, as well as Matthew Green, who is the NDP member of Parliament for the riding of Hamilton Centre in Ontario. Hello to the two of you.
Hi.
Listen, Mr. Naqvi, I'm going to begin with you because you're riding, of course, the epicenter of the protest. What's your reaction to Mayor Watson's assessment that the invocation was a positive step in dealing with the protest?
Well, I think what we heard from the mayor today and what we've been hearing from the witnesses who have been before the commission is really sort of demonstrating and reminding us what my community went through over the 24-day period in the beginning of the year. This protest was not nor lawful or peaceful. It was an occupation of downtown Ottawa, just not the street before Parliament Hill, but also the residential parts of downtown Ottawa. And the result was that so many members of my community were harassed. They were held essentially hostage for over 20 days in their own homes. Seniors who were not able to go to their medical appointments, or children who were not able to attend school because of the level of harassment and intimidation. I mean, we were seeing honking that was taking place all through the day and the night. There were fireworks in the middle of residential streets. And we are hearing from witnesses, including the mayor, that things were out of control. There was no real sense of how this occupation is going to come to an end until the Emergencies Act was invoked, and that resulted in putting an end to this illegal occupation.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Green, you're on record as saying that invoking the act was, quote, have grave implications, but your party also supported the Trudeau government with the invocation. So how do you respond to what you heard from the Ottawa mayor? Does it address the grave implications that you were concerned about?
Well, certainly we made the support based on the information that was publicly available, and of course, based on the fact that we were also experiencing what people across the country were experiencing in terms of the occupation and witnessing the blockades. However, we were doing that based on the information that was publicly made available. What was clear is there was a failure of all levels of government, including the police. I certainly have some concerns and some of the contradictions that are coming up over the course of the inquiry. You know, we have a situation where it appears that many people involved are trying to pass the buck, but ultimately, you know, we're in a scenario where over these next weeks and ensuing months, we hope that we can get the facts of the matter in terms of who knew what when, and be able to provide recommendations back to the House and the Senate to ensure that this Emergency Act situation, this unprecedented, very historic situation, has a more fulsome set of definitions and responsibilities, because what's clear is that in the onset of this, nobody really had a plan.
Well, I want to pick up on that point because, you know, we've yet to hear from the former police chief, but he will be appearing before the commission later on. But what we have seen so far, or at least heard, are from city officials. And one interesting fact was the fact that the city officials in Ottawa, as well as local police, seem to believe that this was only going to be a weekend protest. And that's despite the media reports out there, that's despite the social media postings put out by the organizers of the protest themselves. So given that that was the impression, do you think the Emergencies Act would have been invoked had police done perhaps a better job of monitoring what this protest was about. Mr. Naqvi, what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, we know the protest was taking place, and I don't know as to whether people understood that it will turn into an unlawful and unpeaceful occupation to the extent it did happen. You know, it is important to remind everyone that in our system, police is responsible for matters of policing, to ensure law and order, to ensure security, and politicians cannot tell police what to do or what not to do. So in this particular instance, I mean, I live in Ottawa, I represent downtown core, and so I was quite involved in a lot of the conversations that were taking place. When it came to the matters of operation and enforcement of the law, we were of course relying on Ottawa Police Service, because that is the police service that is responsible for providing security in the downtown core of the Ottawa, even parts that are next to Parliament Hill. And in this case, it's clear that police was not able to stop that occupation. In fact, it continued to grow, even though a lot of resources were being provided by both provincial government and federal government. And in the end of the day, there was no recourse left but to invoke the Emergencies Act that finally did the job. I just also want to remind the fact that we had 2 states of emergency in place in that 20-day period. Ottawa first declared one, and then Ontario declared the next one, but that still did not end the illegal occupation of Ottawa's downtown core, not to mention the blockades that were taking place on borders across the country.
But still, as we said, on social media, even before the protesters got to Ottawa, they were very clear that they were going to be here for some time. So, Mr. Green, what do you think? Had Ottawa Police done a better job of responding to that, do you think the Emergencies Act would have been necessary?
No, I don't. I mean, at the end of the day, this was a wholesale breakdown of policing. And while Mr. Naqvi would like to suggest that politicians weren't involved, we come to know through testimony and disclosure that the mayor of Ottawa was involved. He was trying to negotiate with the organizers of this event. In fact, he facilitated a staging area off-site where they could be refueled and have food and have all of these different replenishments. And so this was a very murky situation, one that would have required strong national leadership across the country, one that would have had certainly premiers who were missing in action. Obviously, you know, Mr. Ford, under the Emergency Act there, could have used the Ministry of Transport to levy fines. The Attorney General of Ontario could have used aid to civil power, and yet none of that stuff occurred. It seemed like everybody was content to point their finger at somebody else, including, quite frankly, the federal government, by taking leadership to ensure that this stuff would come to an end.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Ontario Premier, because he was in the Ottawa region, Western Ottawa, in fact, yesterday, and he was asked about the inquiry, asked about the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Let's take a listen to what we heard from Doug Ford.
I stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister. These folks were, you know, camping out, everything from whirlpools, disrupting downtown, disrupting the lives of the people of Ottawa. We've worked collaboratively with the mayor and the Prime Minister over at the borders. They were holding up $1 billion of trade every single day, getting across our borders. We were getting phone calls from governors. It's unacceptable.
Now, I play that, Mr. Naqvi, because we did hear from the Mayor of Ottawa today describing really his frustration at the lack of urgency with which the Ontario provincial government initially responded to the protests. And yet here we have Doug Ford saying that he was standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister at the time. What do you make of that?
Well, I was delighted to hear the Premier reconfirm his support for the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It highlights that both federal government and provincial government was working in tandem when it comes to ending the occupation, which had lasted for 24 days. I think it's really important to remember that the step to invoke the emergency was an unprecedented step. It's never been done in its 30 years history, and the federal government had to be very cautious and make sure that we do the appropriate consultations, and that's why it did take the step when it did to not only end the occupation here in Ottawa, but also to make sure that no other blockades of our border crossings across the country takes place. One of the most important, I think, aspect of this inquiry is to learn from what happened. That's why this public inquiry is taking place, and hopefully have recommendations as to how these type of situations do not repeat again. Of course, this is not to take away from people's right to protest peacefully, but what we saw in Ottawa, what we saw in our borders was not nor peaceful or lawful.
Mm-hmm. Again, echoed by the Premier, but you know, to listen to the Ottawa Mayor today, the Premier was not as engaged as he should have been in the early days. Mr. Green, I saw you shaking your head when you heard that.
It's absolutely ridiculous. If he's standing shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister, my question is where? You know, the fact remains that the federal government, provincial government were nowhere to be found while the city of Ottawa was left to its own devices. You had residents who had to take to the streets to stop this terrorizing of their neighborhoods, to actually confront in a counter protest the terrorizing of their neighborhoods, while law and order was had completely evaporated and disappeared. And so, you know, we have this situation where, yes, we have this judicial inquiry happening right now, but we also have, through legislation, the ability through the Parliament in our joint review committee, which Mr. Naqvi is on, to have the facts presented to us. And the truth is that over the course of the last 6 months, while we've been trying to get to the bottom of this, the Liberal government has refused to provide answers to Canadians. And no matter which side of the debate people are on, in this particular moment, the most significant decision this House and this session will ever make, the public demands the truth. They demand to have the facts of the matter presented in a way where the public can decide ultimately whether or not the federal government met the threshold to invoke the Emergency Act under the CSIS Act Section 2.
Okay, so I'll give the last word then to you, Mr. Naqvi. Given what we just heard from Mr. Green, how does this inquiry inform the Joint Parliamentary Committee? How does it inform the road forward, do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm going to disagree with Mr. Green's characterization. I think the government, the federal government, is acting in the most transparent manner. There are two processes under Emergencies Act that are taking place. One, the joint committee that Mr. Green and I are part of, and the other, the public inquiry. Documents have been provided, cabinet confidences have been waived. In fact, the Prime Minister will be testifying before the public inquiry as well. And several key ministers have been in front of the joint committee, and they will also be testifying at the public inquiry. So there's a lot of work going on because it was an unprecedented step, but I really believe, and I advocated for it, that it was a necessary step, because after 24 days of an illegal occupation in Ottawa, people were at their wits. Clearly, the Ottawa police was not able to manage or put an end to the situation, and therefore the extraordinary powers under the Act were put in place to help end the occupation and avoid any further blockades of our borders. And the proof, Michael, is that it did work, and we did end the occupation right here in Ottawa.
But going forward, how does the Commission inform what the Joint Committee is going to be doing? I hear you saying that at the end of the day it was effective, but effective is not what's at question here. Whether it was justified is what's questioned here.
That's correct.
Well, and again, I think the public inquiry is looking into this, the work that Joint Committee is doing, and there's a fair bit of evidence that has been generated, and there's more work to be done. All that cumulative evidence, all that cumulative testimony is going to allow us to look at not only the validity of the federal government's decision in invoking the Emergencies Act, which I believe was valid and was the right thing to do, but also to ensure that we learn lessons from this circumstance in order to avoid the same mistakes in the future.
Okay, well, the Commission continues its work. You guys are doing your work, so thank you to the two of you right now. We'll speak again, I'm sure. Yasir Naqvi, Matthew Green, thank you for the time tonight.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
And an editorial note, we did invite the Conservative Party to provide a member of Parliament to be a part of tonight's panel. None were available. Back in June, the Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations introduced a bill to create a National Council for Reconciliation. A direct call of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the bill passed second reading. It is now at the committee stage. And yesterday, national Indigenous leaders commented on the process so far. Joining us now is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, RoseAnne Archibald. She was among the leaders who appeared before committee. Chief Archibald, thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Michael.
Now, there's a lot to talk about here, but I do want to begin with the very idea of a National Council for Reconciliation. Talk to us about what this is and what this effort is meant to address.
This is a recommendation that came out of, or it's one of there's 3 calls to action in this National Council, and that came out of the TRC report, which is very survivor driven. And so this comes from survivors as a recommendation, as a call to action to the government. And as the Assembly of First Nations, we had this discussion last November. I don't know if you remember the whole flag scenario of when the flags would go up and when they would go down. But as an AFN executive, the regional chiefs and I said, you know, one of the things that we need to have happen, a couple of things. One is to place the orange flag somewhere. We wanted it placed on the Peace Tower. We found out that that protocol wasn't possible. And the other thing that we recommended through a motion that we passed was the establishment of this National Council on Reconciliation. So the AFN is absolutely in support of these calls to action that will create the National Council for Reconciliation. And we certainly feel that our call back in November was a concerted effort by ourselves and others to get this council established.
So getting the calls to action, getting some momentum on them, and to your point, this is calls to action 53 to 56 that this council would actually address. Now, it includes multi-year funding for a council. What do you think of that? Is multi-year sufficient?
You know, during my presentation yesterday, I actually said that if reconciliation were a book, let's call it a 12-chapter book. We are in the first chapter, but we're really only on the first sentence of that book of reconciliation. It's a long road. We're talking about over 500 years of colonization. We're talking about hundreds of years of impact around the safety of our children and our women since the beginning of contact. So there's a big, long impact that's happened to First Nations. It's been very damaging to our communities. And so as a result, we really need to think about this long road ahead of us. We need to, the priority and the thing that we must get done as soon as possible are the 94 calls to action. That would be the end of the first sentence. And then there's ongoing work on reconciliation. It's about a relationship. We're trying to reconcile the truth of this country. We're trying to reconcile our relationship with government. We're trying to reconcile our relationships with just non-Indigenous Canadians who have benefited greatly from access to our lands and resources and waters, have built untold wealth on the backs of First Nations people. And so that road to reconciliation is a long one. We have to begin to really talk about economic reconciliation so that our First Nations can move beyond poverty and move into prosperity and have that abundance that the Creator gave us when we were placed here on Turtle Island. So it's a bigger question for me. It's a bigger process. And getting these calls to action done is a part of the council's work to monitor to that, to do an annual kind of assessment of where governments and groups are at in terms of those 94 calls. And it really falls on the federal government for certain to be the main player in those 94 TRC calls to action.
Main player, and when it comes to this national council, it would seem that multi-year is insufficient. It would seem that what you're looking for, based on the description here, is a far more permanent funding model for this council to do its work.
Yeah, sorry, I went down a rabbit hole there.
It's perfectly fine.
But yeah, definitely, you know, we do need long-term funding for the council, and we need long-term funding for reconciliation. And one of the things I've been talking about since I've been elected is to establish a healing fund, a national healing fund. Every time these former institutions of assimilation and genocide are investigated, that triggers every survivor that went to that particular institute, and also survivors across Canada. And it triggers intergenerational trauma survivors. It triggers non-Indigenous Canadians as well. And so we really need to look at what is the national healing path forward. And we need to have that funded, for example. And that's not necessarily in the TRC calls to action specifically that we establish a national healing fund, but to me, it's very obvious that we need one. And long-term funding to this issue is absolutely essential to us walking that healing path forward here on Turtle Island, or what we now call Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you mentioned the testimony that you gave yesterday, it was also interesting because beyond raising the issue of funding and what you said that you already addressed with the committee, another issue that was raised by you had to do with the makeup of the council and how members of this council would be chosen. Talk to us about your concerns right now as to the current proposal if the amendments that you're referencing are not made.
I brought this up with Minister Miller in a phone call before we presented to the committee, and indicated to him that the majority of children who were taken from their homes and their communities were First Nations children. And First Nations have such a wide and deep impact because of these institutions. The Métis also have an impact, and so do the Inuit. Everybody does. And so when we wanted to make a recommendation on the makeup of the council itself, we recommended 3 be appointed by the AFN, 2 by the Métis, and 2 by the Inuit. That makes the majority of the board, and then we would work with the federal government to appoint the remaining members of that council. So that was our recommendation. It's very concise and clear, and whether those amendments are incorporated, we don't know. We want them there. Whether the government acts on them or not is unclear to me.
It was interesting because you said if the amendments are not adopted, it reeks too much of colonialism.
It certainly does, and that was my when I did talk to Minister Miller, I said, you can't drive this process as the government and as the minister. That's very paternalistic. You're falling backward into the old colonial system where, the government feels that it knows better of what First Nations and Indigenous people need. And so that was my comment during the committee, is that we have to move forward, not back into paternalism, but move forward in true partnership. And true partnership means that the perspectives of First Nations, particularly around these institutes, are taken into account in the makeup of the new board, as it were. But again, wanting to support the Métis and Inuit as well in appointing representatives.
Are you hopeful at this point, and we're quickly running out of time, but I do have to ask, are you hopeful at this point that your concerns will be listened to and that a council will be created quickly?
I do have to tell you something about Mark Miller. I've always had a really positive relationship with him, and I met him long before he was the minister, and I just have such a sense of, I guess it is hope that he has heard us and that those changes will be made, but we won't know until, the final reading and the final amendments are made.
Chief RoseAnne Archibald, thank you for this. Always good to speak with you. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
You too. Take care. And that is our program for this evening. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll see you again tomorrow.